You're listening to The Dead Prussian, a podcast about war and warfare.
So we've had a lot of military historians on the show. We've talked a lot about military history. But is there a difference between a military historian and a historian? Is there a difference between military history or history? Or is military history just the history of the military? It's pretty deep. But also, what are the roles of the historian? What are the roles of the military historian? Are military historians just historians that are fanboys for military stuff? Who knows? Well, actually, I do know who knows. My two guests. G'day, listeners, and welcome back to the Dead Prussian podcast. This is the only podcast out there named after a 19th century Prussian military theorist. However, there are lots of shows out there that resemble us, but not quite as good as us. And I say that because we bring a flavour of in-depth academic rigour, excellent humour, and a whole lot of amateurishness. And hopefully that's the way that today's episode is going to go. Today's a special episode. It is a debate. We haven't had a debate on the show before. We've had a panel. We haven't had a debate. And the reason we're having a debate is because of the questions I asked at the start of the show. And if you can't remember those questions, you're pretty thick. My first guest today is Kim A. Wagner, and he teaches the history of colonial India and the British Empire at Queen Mary, University of London. He's written extensively on the subject of Thugee, and I don't know if I pronounced that right, but I'm not really that concerned, the uprising of 1857, and resistance and colonial violence more generally in the 19th and 20th century. His most recent publications include Treading Upon Fires, The Mutiny Motif and Colonial Anxieties in British India, Past and Present, Calculated to Strike Terror, The Amritsar Massacre and the Spectacle of Colonial Violence, Past and Present, and The Skull of Alam Beg, The Life and Death of a Rebel of 1857, and that was published in 2017. My second guest is someone you know from our most popular episode. It pains me to say it, but it's the most popular episode we have. And it might have been because the topic was something that is very, very topical. I'm not going to go too much into how topical it is because there's just been another tragedy over in the US and we don't want to get a certain crowd harassing the show. But I'll introduce my guest. My guest is Matthew Ford, and he is a lecturer in international relations at the University of Sussex. Prior to lecturing there, he was a lecturer in war and security at the University of Hull, which is a place in the UK. It's a very nice, if you like, grey, drizzly weather. He's a sessional lecturer in international security at Birkbeck College, London, and a teaching assistant at King's College, London. He has also occasionally taught as a sessional lecturer in history at the University of Birmingham. That's where all the Brummies come from. Matthew has a PhD from the Department of War Studies at King's College London, an MA in War Studies from KCL, that's the same place, and a BA Honours in Philosophy from the University of Reading, spelt reading. Prior to completing his PhD, Matthew worked for a top 4 global management consultancy. After completing his doctorate in 2008, he joined the UK Civil Service as a strategic analyst with Policy and Capability Studies Department of DSTL. That's an agency of the UK Ministry of Defence. He's published in a number of journals, and these include the Journal of Strategic Studies, Small Wars and Insurgencies, War in History, Studies in Conflict, Terrorism, and Parameters. That's the journal of the US Army War College, and we've talked a little bit about that on the show before, that particular journal. Quite good to read. His research interests focus on military innovation, that's the buzzword of the century, socio-technical change, and the social construction of military effects and strategy. He's a former West Point Fellow and winner of the Society for Military History's Russell F. Weegley Graduate Award. Matthew has written extensively about military technical change, especially as it relates to the infantry and their experience of battle, which is not that fun. Matthew is an honorary historical consultant to the Royal Armouries in Leeds, the UK, and he's also the editor of the British Journal for Military History, and his first book is called Weapon of Choice, which we did our first episode on, and it was the one that you guys have loved. So thank you, listeners, for downloading that. Gents, thanks very much for coming on the show.
Pleased to join you, Mick. How's my innovation podcast coming?
Yeah, it's fine. We're not going to go into the stats. Not because I'm not happy with them, but I just don't want to upset my other guests.
Well, this one's going to be a corker as well.
Yes. Well, I reckon this one will. Well, if people know that you're on this episode, I'm sure they'll download it just for that reason.
You're trying to tell me? Sorry, go on.
You're popular.
I was going to say I've got a fan club. I can't believe it.
Yeah.
In Australia.
No, it's. No, you'd be surprised how many Australians have not downloaded that episode. Actually, no, there's been a lot of Australian infantry have downloaded that episode. But I think mainly it's because of the blatant self-promotion as well. They're very good at that.
Thank you very much. Please.
All right, gents. So we'll get into this. So hopefully I can ask you some questions that provide a difference of opinion. Now, if you happen to be in agreement on anything today, please feel free to make sure it's violent agreement, because this is also about entertaining our listeners as well. But if you do become a little bit boring or your answer is a little too long-winded, we will have a noise, and that noise will be... And that is to cut you off, and then the next person can respond. The other noise, and this is for people who have done particularly well... That means that, yes, that's the answer. And because I actually have the answer for all the questions that will be asked and discussed during this debate. All right, so the first question I want to ask, and it relates to an article written by Kim, and also a debate that's raged on since, a bit of blogging on Defence in Depth. I think have hosted a few of the articles. And David Morgan Owens had a bit of a weigh-in. I think Jonathan Botts had a bit of a weigh-in. There's been a great Twitter discussion. So my first question goes to you, Kim, and it is there a difference between a historian and a military historian?
Well, in an ideal world, there wouldn't be. In an ideal world, military history would simply be a thematic focus. Of historians, but I think in reality there is actually a distinction, and of course we're talking very broad strokes here. I find it problematic when military historians pursue history as if military history was its own distinct subject that required its own not just thematic focus, but also its own methodology and theory, which in the worst instances exist or operate quite distinct from a lot of other historical fields. So what I do, for instance, you could very easily describe as military history. I've written about something that Matthew will appreciate as nerdy as Dum Dum Bullets.
What are you saying? Dum Dum Bullets are nerdy? I've written a whole book about guns. That's not nerdy.
Yeah, it is.
Sorry.
Writing a book about guns is nerdy as well. Yeah. Anyway, continue, Kim, please.
And yet I would never consider myself to be a military historian. So that's really about the kind of questions you ask and how you approach a topic. So my critique of military history, broadly conceived, is also a reflection of my own frustration of having quite substantial literature that really I should be able to engage with, and a lot of scholars with whom I should have things in common, but where I found there's actually a quite significant distance that in some ways is insurmountable. So my critique of military history, such as it is also a call for openness to some extent. I know that's not neither entertaining nor polemic, but
that's right.
It's a starter for 10.
That's right. That's the starter, and we'll get onto the main course pretty soon. But I really want to use the soundboard, but Con didn't give me anything, so I'm not going to use it. Matt, and what about you? Is military history a different field than just history? Don't sit on any fences. Does military history deserve its own methodology? Is it a different history than that practiced by other historians?
So I think Kim really puts his finger on a couple of really important things, and I think it's first thing to note is I genuinely don't speak for the, it's not my place to speak for the field or to try and defend anything. I'm just going to advance my own point of view.
But I'm going to tell everyone that it is your role. So for listeners, Matt is completely wrong there. He is speaking for every military historian out there. Matt, please go on.
That's very, very generous. And I expect my inbox of my email to be swamped with angry people because I've misrepresented them. Yes, very kind, Mick. As this goes globally, I expect I'm going to need to get some more space on my mail server. But anyway,
think of the downloads. Think of the downloads.
I think Kim's really hit on a important challenge that it doesn't get articulated very often and needs some care and attention to unpack in its entirety. I'm going to have to violently agree with Kim. That military history as a field for an academic, I think it is absolutely the case that the same rigors and academics rigors and precision in the approach to theory and method are essential and critical for being able to make explicit your underlying assumptions and justify some of the conclusions that you might reach. And I think that academic scholars, academics working in the field, are better placed, or should be better placed. I'm not going to say they all, there's lots of different people working on lots of different things here. But, my impression is that they should be better placed to be able to explain some of the choices that they make about what they prefer to study and what they prefer not to, what they prefer to research and what they don't. And therefore they can or should be better placed to defend themselves and make explicit the choices that they make in a way that's academically rigorous and justifiable. The real underlying problem, I suppose, it's a fault line, if you like. Is that there are a whole load of people who work on the history of war, military history as traditionally conceived, who do excellent work by a variety of standards, and a whole heap of other people who don't do quite so excellent work. But that becomes obvious to people who get deeply read deeply into this stuff.
Yeah.
Who aren't necessarily academically trained, and therefore might be evaluated by academics as not standing up to the not conforming to the kind of academic standards that otherwise we might expect. And so these military historians, these amateur military, I'm going to say amateur, it's not, I'm not trying to be rude about them, about people, but there's a whole heap of things that are going on here that they fruitfully get stuck into and engage with, that professional academic historians don't have the time or capacity to do, and they typically unearth interesting things. The question then is whether the apparatus is around, the methodological, theoretical, academic apparatus is around is there to be able to explain some of the choices that they make or justify some of the choices that they make about what's research and what's not. And the challenge for people in doing history of war, military histories, is that there's a need to engage with some of these people constructively and try to have a dialogue, if you like, precisely because military history as a field, as far as I can see, certainly in the UK, but I don't know it's like in Australia or other parts of the world, military history in the UK is one of those places where the general public really engage with an appreciation of military in society, or they start to, people learn about armed forces in society, certainly in the UK, through military history, through memorialization, through this kind of stuff. And so, for me at least, whilst I recognise these academic, non-academic distinctions, it seems important to me to try and bridge them and to try and have some form of negotiation or discussion or dialogue between these two branches. Despite the fact that I think, what Kim said is is fairly true. From an academic point of view, there are standards, and as historians, I think it is important to try and sustain and maintain them.
So you were very, very close to the buzzer then. It's interesting you talk about, the amateur historians. I know you're not trying to be rude, but I'll call them amateurs. Interestingly enough, a lot of them, I know, particularly in Australia, the most popular military history books are not written by anyone who is, and my Australian academic mates are going to lynch me for this, but it's not written by the academically trained. It's written by, I'm going to say ham historians, because one of them's last name is actually Ham. But they are ham historians. One of them is actually the leader of our Republican movement over here in Australia, which just seems like a whole lot of effort for not much change. The whole Republican movement. I'm neither here nor there on the debate, simply because I'm apathetic to the amount of energy it would take to go either way. But it's interesting because they make a lot of money. Some of these guys and girls out there writing bad history. They also shape public opinion. In Australia, it's not as strong as it is in the UK in the way that our public engages in military history. It's a lot shallower. But then again, our military history is also a lot shallower. We have commemoration around this great mythology of Anzac, and a lot of it is pure mythology. And the mythology comes about because of the amateur historians who have been popular over the time, and then legitimate academically trained historians don't get their say. So I guess I'll throw it back to Kim. Just anything to add on the, I'm going to bastardise Matt's argument here, and he said, Matt's kind of saying there's a point where academic military historians need to engage with some of these amateur military historians in the community to ensure that, I guess, there's a bridge there between the two aspects of the military history community that are engaging with the public. What do you say to that?
I don't actually think the problem, and it's problem in inverted comma, the issue is about the involvement or engagement with historians without an academic degree.
Yeah, ham historians.
I actually trying to be polite here.
Yeah, it's okay. I don't have to be polite. It's my show.
I'm arrogant enough as it is. I don't want to use the word amateur.
It's not the rumor I've heard, Kim.
Okay. But I'm not sure that is an issue in and of itself, and that the academic military historians fail to engage with what popular historians, if you want to call it that.
Yeah.
I think the kind of military history that I have an issue with is actually where the distinction between academic military historians and what you describe as amateur historians, but also the military institutions themselves, what's usually referred to as practitioners, kind of correlate. And that is what I refer to as parochial military history, which is distinct from other kinds of academic military historians who may not necessarily feel the need to engage with either the best-selling, studies of First World War trench warfare or Nazi Germany, or the defense studies departments, but still study military history. So I think one of the sort of distinctions I thought of was there are people doing military history who could fit into any number of departments and be described not as military historians, but as modern British historians or global historians. Yeah. And that's where I think the issue really is, that there is a label that people, they are deeply wedded to, and that label allows, and I can understand why you would want to have a huge readership. I mean, what are the bestsellers? What's the big section in any bookshop? It's there's world wars, some counterinsurgency, Napoleonic wars. Yeah, it's big money, and I can't blame people for engaging with that. But it has, I think, established a sort of sphere unto its own, And that is what, when other historians, they talk disparagingly about military history, that's what they're referring to. So nobody is actually questioning the relevance of looking at armed forces or conflict or warfare. It's the way it's done.
Yeah.
It's the questions that we ask.
It's interesting you talk about the big sections in the bookstores. It seems that anytime Germany invades France or any other neighbour, it just creates a new section in a bookstore for people to read. Which actually, maybe there's a conspiracy theory there. Is Germany only invading its neighbours every now and then just to drive up book sales? But that's for another episode. Once I find someone who actually owns a bookshop. Not too many of them these days. Look, Matt. So, Kim's argument is quite clear there. Military historians in stovepipes, or historians who study the military in engaging with wider departments, wider, I guess, policymakers. I'm going to make the leap there and assume that Kim's also talking about people who deal with policy in defence as well. What's your view? Do we have a role? I mean, you edit a journal of military history. Is your journal just a history journal that tends to have a bit of a war bent?
So let me start by saying that I think there are plenty of historians or scholars working in defence studies departments that are excellent. Right? There's no doubt that they contribute, they're academically, methodologically, theoretically astute and know how to work their way around some of these pitfalls and challenges. What I think when it comes to how military history shapes policy, I think that is a serious challenge for me. I was working in the Ministry of Defence when the penny dropped that Afghanistan was all going pear-shaped.
Yeah.
1839.
Yeah. Whichever.
When F lost its gun.
And I was acutely conscious that the public record would be something that would be fought over by historians immediately after Britain had withdrawn out of the Middle East.
Yeah.
And I was deeply concerned that academia might find itself implicated in this process rather than implicated in a process of advancing a particular narrative rather than being able to hold itself back and sustain a critical perspective of and a much more objective, or that might be I realize that that's a loaded term, but I'm just going to put it out there, much more objective way of looking at Britain's involvement in that part of the world. And I'm conscious of the fact that, and I think this is what both Kim and I are probably circling around, that military history is a political site as much as it is a site to do good history.
Yeah.
And in that respect, there are a lot of reasons why the UK Ministry of Defence, for example, won't want to engage with a really meaningful lessons learned exercise. And that's because, certain people, colonels and above, will be implicated in what has gone on in they all work studiously well and hard and all the rest of it. But, there's a lot of difficulty about engaging critically, really critically with what went on in that part of the world. And that has the potential to sort of spin out and skew an initial public record or an initial interpretation that then unhinges how we might think about future war and how that might frame our attitudes towards future war. And that was what, straight after Iraq and Afghanistan, as soon as I left the Ministry of Defence, I was very conscious that academics had a duty really to try to engage more sensitively, more critically, more carefully with these challenges. And the journal really, for me anyway, I mean, there are lots of people involved in the journal, and they all have their own unique reasons for being involved.
Yeah.
But for me personally, that was where, I realised that military history is a political site, and I wanted to make sure that academics had some means by which they could shape the politics of that through engaging with the general public. So that's where that came from. I don't know whether we're any better at engaging with the policy community, but because we're free, at least we had that, there was an opportunity to get a message out there that might, that at least wasn't subject to some kind of paywall or whatever.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you get the right Google Chrome plugin, the paywall can be fixed. And that's all I'm going to say on that one. Don't come after me, anyone. So there's some interesting areas here, particularly the role of military historians in different branches. And, you talk about the good work people do in defence studies departments and strategic studies departments. Most of those departments tend to be staffed, I know, particularly in Australia, full of military historians who then teach, I'd say, more current strategic policy type lessons. Interestingly enough, though, I read a book once, and this book was called The History Manifesto. I'm not sure if you've read it, gents, but it's written by Joe Gouldy and some bloke. Sorry, some bloke. I forgot your name. I couldn't find my copy because I've recently moved houses. That's right. We've moved studios. Armitage. That's the guy. And in that book, they call for historians in general to engage with policy and policy making in a more fruitful manner. Particularly because other fields, science, economics, anthropology, are better at doing that, and they are better at getting into certain departments. And maybe it's because, particularly with military historians, this is me putting a bit of a bent on what I read, maybe because military historians find it harder getting access to the military. Maybe they don't. In fact, I know plenty of military historians that have deployed on exercise and operations with myself. But this is leading to my question. We've talked about it. What is the role of a historian, and what is the role, and by de facto, what is the role of the military historian? If we're in agreement that a military historian is just a historian that studies war and warfare, but what is the role of a historian in society? Should they play a role in informing the policy now? Because we've seen Sir Lawrence Freedman. He was part of the Chilcot Report, and a lot of people say that we're probably a little too close to the engagement in the Middle East to call it real history, because at the moment there's a lot of opinions, a lot of personal investment, as you said, Matt, still a lot of personal investment of personal players and political players involved in shaping the narrative of what that is. So if we're too close for that to be good history, I won't say real history because it's real history, but if we're too close for it to be truly objective, using your term there, Matt, where are we? Are historians, do they have a role? Do historians engage 50 years later? Or do historians engage now? What is their role in society?
I'd like to jump, Kim, if you don't mind. I'm going to jump in just you can give me an opportunity. You can have a go at me if you need to. But it seems to me that it seems to me that we've gone through 100 years of the First World War commemoration, and only now I think a First World War historian is starting to emerge after 100 blimmin' years.
Emerge. They're everywhere. They're bloody everywhere.
Yeah, exactly. 100 years it's taken for us to come to a more rounded evaluation of that great conflict, right?
Yeah.
100 years? Geez, 100 years, what's going on? Anyone would think that we needed to have that sorted out within, 5 or 10. Otherwise, we'd be into the Second World War.
Well, that was a rematch.
We were into the Second World War. The thing about counterinsurgency in the UK, no one was really willing to critically engage with counterinsurgency until we got stuck into a bloody counterinsurgency in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Yeah.
The result of which is that we've had a plethora of great histories that demonstrate that counterinsurgency is pretty nasty stuff and a bit dirty like all war. But it would have been nice maybe if historians had engaged with this problem more critically, in the 60 years of counterinsurgency that Britain had been pursuing immediately after the Second World War. So it took within a year the strategic bombing survey of the Second World War had been conducted with a view to it shaping and influencing how air power might be used by the US Air Force in the Cold War. A year.
Yeah.
Right? It's taken us 100 years to do the First War and we're still re-evaluating counterinsurgency. I don't. If Kim starts on imperialism, we'll be here all bloody day. You know, you know, historians need to get a grip, put simply. And so you'll excuse my impassioned statement on this, but you know, it's kind of. I know we don't have to be responsive to the policy agenda instantly, but I think it is important to try and create a intellectual space that allows us to ask the questions that otherwise go unanswered. And I think that is or unasked. And that seems to me to be the role of an academic department, to try and encourage those spaces. Unfortunately, or fortunately, because this is just the way academia works, or like any profession, there are sort of fashions, and you know, some things come in and go out of fashion, and some things that become important to a community and become less important. You know, innovation you referenced earlier,
very fashionable,
has become important. But you know, something else will happen in the future. But I do think that, you know, academics and academics themselves, this is where there can be an opportunity to. And we need to be a bit more careful and directive about it to create those intellectual spaces where those awkward questions might be asked.
And
can I say something now?
Yeah.
Yes,
I just want to point out that in the profession of podcasting, Australian senses of humour are quite fashionable. But yeah, Kim, go on the attack.
I thought Matthew's intervention is extremely revealing. And I think it speaks. I mean, it basically answers the opening question: what was the difference between a military historian and a historian?
Yeah.
Because historians of empire, global history, colonial resistance, or anti-colonial resistance, rather, we have known this for century, decade. It's not as if it's a new revelation that counterinsurgency might not be this surgical and humanitarian endeavor. It's just that those historians who work on, for instance, Africa or South Asia, don't use the term counterinsurgency, and whatever scholarship has been produced has not been incorporated within military history, narrowly defined.
Yeah.
So. And that's exactly the point I'm trying to make.
Yep.
That there is a disconnect between military history as something that is, I think I can use the word embedded within the military institutions, which is closely aligned to military education. And then you can call it ivory tower scholarship, which does not make any claims to relevance or influencing policy. So the problem is not that military historians don't engage with policy. I think the problem is the opposite, actually, that a lot of the type of military history that I have an issue with is at its worst is no more than institutional history.
Yeah.
And therefore tied in, and as you mentioned, and that's where, you know, the amateur historians, a lot of them are former military personnel themselves.
Yeah.
That you have an entire field which ask questions, the same kind of questions that you would ask at a military academy, or that you would ask, you know, within policymaking circles.
Yeah.
And that at its worst is completely separate from, I don't want to call it critical scholarship, but you know, straight up academic studies. And I think that's really the key issue here. We assume that we are all engaged in the same thing. We assume we're all studying the invasion of Iraq, but actually we are not, because, you know, historians of the Middle East, they would start with the First World War and the first, you know, use of Royal Air Force and bombing and these kind of things, whereas people working within strict confines of military history look at it in terms of the institutional practices, doctrines, these kind of things.
But I mean, a lot of what you've just said, I want to violently agree with, because I think you're. I mean, but I did obviously also preface in my previous response, the point, precisely the point that you just made, which is that military historians are predisposed to looking at things in a particular way, and the challenge for an academic historian is to be able to explain and justify and relate the assumptions that they've made in a meaningful and academic way. And I suppose Mick drew me onto my favourite turf, which is the journal that I founded.
You're welcome.
But that was my very kind. I mean, that was my personal agenda, which was a sense of needing to remain at distance from those kinds of institutionalized approaches to how the immediate aftermath of Iraq and Afghanistan would be interpreted. But I know that this field or subfield is kind of a very broad space, and I think that Kim has to be right in that there is a need to if scholars choose to go down the route of looking for the preface of what he's saying is there's around military history there's a policy relevance, right? It's sort of it's intimately connected to that kind of notion of policy relevance.
Yep.
Now, I suppose the broader social question for me is whether, if there is this urge, and it seems to me that there is an urge within military institutions to instrumentalize history in this way, the real challenge, it seems to me, is that for historians to try to resist the urge to have their product, their copy, their intellectual insights and observations, to try to continue to maintain some degree of objectivity in this, and to be able to regularly explain and make explicit why they are working down a particular line of investigation, why they're asking some questions and not asking others, why they're not drawing on some of those more critical interpretations and then feeding them into the debate in defence institutions. I'd hazard a guess. I don't know, because I've not taught at anywhere that teaches the military, but I'd hazard a guess that probably some of the staff college type places, they do try to do that. Yeah. Or that there is a degree of frustration amongst those academics where that isn't possible and where they would like to. And I think that as a political site where there is a restriction on what might be taught because of the particular needs of a military academy, that I think is fair game for Kim to take a crack at, because it needs to be history warts and all rather than history cherry picked to suit a particular instrumental agenda.
Well, having been a student at one of those colleges you mentioned, and on the receiving end of what I would call a barrage of military history, being instrumentalized. What I find interesting, you talk about history warts and all. And we've talked about the World War One because I'll use the American term because I'm talking to two people based in the UK. But if we talk about the First World War, and we talk about how it's taught, now there's a lot of people out there who think some bloke getting shot in Sarajevo is why the First World War came about. And then there's other people that they go to these courses and they take, let's call it the Cliff Notes version of history, and they're like, no, I've read the Cliff Notes. It actually goes back a little bit earlier to an arms race. And other people are like, well, what about the Great White Fleet? There's a big show of power, but the US didn't invade Europe. So there's lots of different opinions, but what I've found is in a lot of the ways that people try and instrumentalise history is they have to leave bits off. So very rarely do, I would say, a lot of military institutions get taught about German unification being an important factor in World War One. That's the First World War to you British people. So I guess the point I'm getting at here is, yes, it definitely happens to institutions, and whether you're teaching the military or policymakers, there's an element of military history having to be instrumentalized, and that means you're going to lose some of those warts, right? So my question to both of you, if military history can't be instrumentalized to provide lessons to those people who will be engaged in making further history in this area, what good is
it?
Useless rubbish. Well, I think it's a fair point, but there is a very, very important distinction between studying the past in order to instrumentalize it, and studying the past because you're a nerd, and perhaps coming up with something that can be applied and that provides lessons. But my problem with sort of a weak objectivist approach to history is that and I think in the sort of in the caricature of what military history is, it's sort of the good general, bad general, why this campaign was won, or what are the key factors. I forgot my train of thought there. But that is looking at the past in order to answer very, very distinct questions about how to wage a successful campaign or not to, and the lessons that can be drawn, the sort of straight out of the Sandhurst and West Point, where another type of historian might look at the very same conflicts, but never really be too interested in those technical points, but rather in the broader context of, whatever it might be, racial issues, economic issues. And that essentially means that it's not the same kind of historical endeavor that people are engaged in. And I think if you asked, a panel of people who self-identify as military historians, and people who might work on military history but who may not call themselves military historians, the definition or description of what history is, what the historian's task is, would be would really differ on significant points. And that's one of my sort of key I don't know if I want to call it disclaimer, but key arguments is that if we recognize that what I describe as parochial military history is something distinct from history, capital H, that's fine. We can't pretend that we are engaged in the same sort of scholarly inquiry. So to some extent, it's just acknowledging that the military history section in the bookstore will have been subjected to a less rigorous peer review and will have fewer footnotes and primary sources in non-English or non-European languages compared to the world history section. And I'm not necessarily talking about my own stuff here. But if we need to kind of accept that there are real differences, which is more than just about different departments. It's more than just about the state of book sales or political investment. That at the most basic level, what we do, we perceive and make sense of in very different ways. Which is why you will or my gripes in sort of very specific terms about a lack of engagement with methodology and theory. And I just want to say, before we get any further, of course, military history is not the only field which suffers from, tunnel vision or sort of an inward culture and a development of sort of particular obtuse, ways of thinking and presenting itself. You could level that critique at a number of other fields. It just happens to be what I'm working on now.
Maybe we need to target the classics next and get Tom Holland and Mary Beard on the show and ask them how their book sales are going. But I'll throw to you, Matt. mainly because I see you keep trying to talk and I'm just having fun interrupting you. But I'll throw to you, Matt, to respond to Kim because, I thought it was a very good point. So if you disagree with him, I'll just mute you. Go.
I was actually going to develop Kim's point, which was really that,
instrumentalizing it.
Excellent.
Well, possibly. That's very kind, trying to take the wind out of my sails before I get started. But let me develop your point a little bit further. In that, yes, I think that there are those divisions, if you like. If you want to, I think it is possible to construct a map of the subdiscipline in the way that I think we're violently agreeing. That in the first order of things, there are these communities and sub-communities. There are these. I think all historians are nerds, but military historians are particularly nerdy. You used the word nerd, and I couldn't. And obviously, I wrote a book about guns. You couldn't get more nerdy than that. I think I'd like to suggest that. Yeah, thank you. But I think I'd like to suggest I tried to do something a little bit more intelligent than just indulge in conversations about rivets. But I think what I was going to say was that if the fact is that this scholarship, these authors are producing this military history is being written, and it is occupying a space on the bookshelves of bookshops, and it seemed to me, and that certainly was my feeling about the way the BJMH the British Journal for Military History might work. It seemed to me that there was a fruitful terrain. It was important to try and get academic scholars. You used the word ivory tower a couple of times, Kim, but to have to create a space in which academics could get out of the ivoy tower.
The dusty library. Let's say dusty library, because
the dusty library.
No academic can afford an ivory tower.
There's some ambition, it seems to me, amongst academic colleagues to think of their research as sort of research for its own sake. But quite a lot of what academia does, certainly in the UK, and I imagine it's the same elsewhere, is kind of instrumentalized through government grants and the research frameworks that are put out there anyway. So I kind of think ivory tower, yes, but also possibly a bit overstated. But but that's one side of it. The really important thing is that if we take our responsibilities as I'm going to use this phrase, public intellectuals. It's a bit. I hesitate because I'm not sure I count. But I'm trying to live up. I feel a bit like a dilettante. I'm trying to live up to the moniker, even if I don't really feel like I am. But if we're going to do our duty as academics and public intellectuals, then it seems also imperative to try to engage in that kind of debate, to try and shape it, to try and turn it to in a way that allows us, people who have thought more critically about scholarship and how scholarship works, to try and make sure that there is a voice out there that might also in turn shape the public agenda. And I realize that actually, one of the great things about authors, military historians, is that they write really engaging and anecdotally fascinating stuff. You can always attract people into a book with a battle. Or a general, or a decision, a particular moment in a campaign, and I know that historians, as an academic community, when people are, I think, at the very advanced stage in their careers, when they've written lots and lots of books and have a real sense of what it is to do crossover trade, and by trade I mean sort of general popular history and academically informed history, they really do understand how to write in a very, very accessible way. But actually, generally speaking, when historians are writing, it can be academic historians writing. It can be a very technical exercise, and that tends to turn off the general public, which puts I mean, put it bluntly. I mean, it can be very informative for the scholarly community, but immediately, as you say, it's a £80 job that goes straight into an academic library. Gets pulled out once or twice and never actually, despite the fact that there's good quality and interesting, informative, useful stuff in there, it doesn't get drawn out into the wider public arena. And I think it would be inappropriate to say that all academics need to do that, because some colleagues are more willing to engage in that kind of discussion than others, and but where there is an appetite to do it, I think that the inspiration of the British Journal of Military History was to try and provide some kind of platform that would allow that kind of discussion or debate to happen. And I recognise that is actually a very difficult set of things to do really good scholarly, well thought through, properly researched history, and to make it accessible. That is a tough ask, and I think people underestimate how hard that is. I think that's what I'd say.
Well, gents, this is going pretty well, because I've now discovered a new term I can add to my CV. I am now a public intellectual. I've decided.
Nerd.
I am one. Yeah, a nerd who's not afraid to go outside. Now, you talked about engaging in debate, and part of the mission of this show is to frame a debate on war and warfare and the conversation that occurs around it, because it's an important issue and we need to continue to talk about it, and part of that is defining it. So each guest that comes on the show, and Matt knows this spiel quite well, and I'm sure Kim does because he listens to every episode, I'm also sure of that. Each guest that comes on the show is asked to define war by finishing a certain sentence, to help us engage in this conversation as part of the Dead Prussian podcast community, but as part of the wider society. So I'm going to throw to Kim first, and then I'll go to Matt, because Matt's had a shot at this already, and you're not allowed to use the answer you've already used, Matt, in the Dead Prussian podcast. Well, it's the most popular episode, so if you do say it again, it'll become pretty clear, because the audience will jump up and down. Although I think most of your downloads were NRA members.
Thank you very much.
The sentence to finish, Kim, is war is. So I invite you to finish the sentence, war is.
Cool to study. Oh, we're not allowed to curse.
Yeah.
Sorry.
He's got bleeped already.
That was my
That's all right. I can bleep that. I just got marked as explicit. Sorry, go again.
Be serious now. Come on.
War is hell to write about, something like that.
Excellent, and we'll throw to you, Matt. And hey, feel free to swear. It just means this has now gone to. In fact, the cursing will actually help this episode sell, because it'll go to an explicit rating.
G'day.
You sound Australian.
War is an industry. There we go.
Oh, of course, because you want to sell more books on technology development.
Liberal snowflake. I'm done here.
Well, gents, there we go. We've got two. War is hell to write about, or something like that, and war is an industry. And an attack on the military-industrial complex there from Matt, who they provide all the topics for his writings. I don't know why he's attacking them, but that's just what he does. Look, gents, thank you very much for coming on the show. I've had a cracker of an evening after a long day. You're my third interview for the day, and it's. I'm not going to say I saved the best for last, but I saved definitely the most energetic for last, because the listeners will determine what is the best. And given your download rates already, Matt, I'm sure you'll do quite well. So thanks for coming on the show, gents. Try not to attack each other in the corridors on the way out, but we are in a virtual room, so you are a reasonable distance away from each other, I trust.
Britain is very small. Everybody knows each other. All bald men in Britain know each other. It's like.
Well, I didn't want to mention it for our listeners that I'm the only one that has hair on the top of my head, but I'm not convinced I have the most hair on my head out of the three people here. So for those people who haven't seen a photo of Kim, he has a cracker of a beard that puts Matt's beard to shame, and I don't even have a beard, so I guess I lose on that account. But gents, thanks very much for coming on the show.
Thank you. Now.
Yes.
Cheers.
And listeners, you can support both these gents by Googling them, because it's a lot easier for me to say Google them rather than read out all the various web addresses, but also reading what they write and reading their books. And I promise I'll try and twist Kim's arm to come back on the show and talk about 1857, because it sounds like a fascinating topic, regardless of whether or not Matt thinks it was too long ago to actually learn any lessons from. Now, on Twitter, you can follow Matt on @WarMatters, and you can follow Kim @KimATI Wagner. And on there, you'll find the links to their writing, as well as following them on Twitter is very, very entertaining. It's how this conversation came about, and this debate continues to go. And these are two gents that are not shrinking violets when it comes to publicly engaging in robust debate, not just about the history, but also public commentary and, as they said, public intellectuals. For you listeners, thanks for all the reviews. It's been great. We've tried to do some topics that are a little bit out there from our normal fare, even things such as getting two historians to come on and have a discussion around a pretty meaty topic relating to history. So please send in your reviews, send your feedback in. We're getting attacked by the spam bots on our contact form, so just email deadprussian@gmail.com rather than using our contact form on the website. The web manager still hasn't been able to fix that, and it's been quite a few weeks now. So I'm receiving lots and lots of advertisements for medication that can help me perform in various ways through the website. So if it actually is you out there, spam bots, please stop it. I'm not buying any medication. But until next time, listeners, grab a book and crack on.
Join the conversation with us on Twitter @DeadPrussianPod, on Facebook @The Dead Prussian page, or on our website www.thedeadprussian.com. All show notes for this episode, as well as copyright information, can be found on the website. The Dead Prussian podcast is written, produced and hosted by Mick Cook. It is co-produced by Amanda Levito. The music used throughout is Caught in the Beat by Broke for Free and is used under a Creative Commons Attribution license. All opinions expressed by individuals on the podcast are those of the individual and not necessarily representative of any other organisation.